Our house has a basement crawl space that's only accessible from outside, through a door directly underneath my bedroom window and about 10 feet from the bottom of the steps leading up to the back deck. It's a fairly large space, dirt floor and concrete walls, clean and plenty big enough for a grown man to stand up in. Until recently, it was half full of junk, mostly from our kitchen renovation, like paint cans and equipment and extra floor tiles and such, and had a padlock on it. We asked our yard guy to do some extra work that included cleaning it completely out, and when it was empty, we didn't bother putting the lock back on. It has a sliding bolt on it that keeps it closed in addition to the little loop thingy that you put the padlock on, so we just slid in the bolt and called it good. There was absolutely nothing in it, so no point in locking it. A couple of weeks ago, my boyfriend was out on the back deck emptying the recycling bins and noticed the door open. Someone would have had to have opened it. The sliding bolt is a bit rusty and wouldn't easily come open, and certainly wouldn't have opened on its own. He went and checked it out. Nobody there. Still completely empty. He thinks, well, okay, someone was poking around and didn't find anything interesting, but he did tell me about it and reminded me to keep the doors locked when he isn't home. A few days after that, I had the dog outside, and he ran straight to the door and started sniffing and scratching at it, and I noticed that it was slightly open again. I opened it, went inside, and walked around. Nobody there. Let me add here that we have a lot of trees and wildlife on our property, including raccoons and groundhogs in addition to tons of squirrels. We have our huge oak tree that overhangs the roof covering the master bedroom, so it's nothing unusual to hear squirrels and other animals on the roof with their little pattering feet and scratching sounds. Yesterday I was here alone, laying in bed reading a book, the house completely silent. Usually the dog will lay in bed with me, but he was fidgety acting. He was pacing and just acting really weird. I was hearing the usual late afternoon squirrels or whatever on the roof, but when I hear a noise that is clearly the crawl space door creaking open. It's directly underneath the window to my right, so I stand up and creep over to the window, crack the shades a tiny bit to peek out, and I see a man starting up the steps to the back deck, having just exited the crawl space. Immediately, my heart drops. I dropped the shades and headed up the hall directly to the door he was heading for to confront him. At that same moment, my dog went nuts, barking, and beat me to the door, but he was nowhere in sight when I got there. I only saw him through the window for a second, and I only saw him from the back as he was heading up the steps. He was wearing a ball cap, so I couldn't even have said what color his hair was. I'm guessing the dog scared him away, but what was he doing walking up on my porch in broad daylight with someone obviously home if he hadn't planned on knocking the door? And no one would knock on that door anyway. People come to the front to knock, not walk all the way out back in the trees in the backyard. I waited a few minutes, then got my pepper spray out of my purse and went to investigate. Sure enough, the crawl space door was open again, no one inside. When my boyfriend got home, he put the padlock back on it. Then he got my gun out of the safe where it's been for years and insisted I keep it under the mattress on my side of the bed. I only agreed to that after he loaded it with rat shot because I don't think I could actually shoot a human being, not even in self-defense, and rat shot won't do much more than scare someone with the noise of the shot. He was mad at me that I went by myself into the basement to check things out, but I'm more angry than frightened. I don't know if I'm overreacting, that just because someone has been inside the basement a few times, I automatically assume that the man I saw was responsible and that he meant harm. I'm fairly certain he did come from there, though, because I definitely heard the door open just seconds before I saw him on the steps. With it locked up now, though, if someone had been routinely in and out, that will stop. Like I said, I just don't know if I'm freaking out over nothing. I'm keeping my doors locked, just in case. But what do you think? My parents split when I was about 14. It wasn't a good breakup. My dad was abusive and an addict, so When my mom left him, she was in a really bad place. Her and my older sister was in her 20s and in full-blown party mode, kept taking her to local bars since my mom was depressed. This led my mom to becoming an alcoholic since my sister was well on her way to becoming one too. During one of these nights, she met a guy. I didn't know much about him, just that they met him and his brother at a bar, and now she was dating him. It went pretty fast, and my sister would flirt with the brother to get free food and drinks from him. Around this time, I was about 15, and this dude just seemed off. He was probably early 40s or so, and he was always going on my mom's dates with his brother. He just kind of hung around a lot. One day, my sister decided she wanted sushi and called up the brother to take us because she knew he would pay. I did not want to go, but we didn't have food in the house, and I was hungry. We didn't have a sushi place in our town, so we had to drive to the city, which was about 30 minutes away. The entire ride, I just had this warning feeling in my stomach that kept telling me to get out of the car, that this was a bad idea. I was a giant ball of anxiety the whole 30 minutes. My sister sat in the front seat completely oblivious to what was happening. Meanwhile, I kept catching him staring at me in the rearview mirror. Once we got to the restaurant, he sat himself down directly across from me. He wanted to sit next to me, but I just rushed to sit next to my sister instead. It was awkward, but my sister talked a lot, so I was able to kind of hide. Eventually, she got up to go to the bathroom, and then I was alone with him. Almost immediately, he asked me if I had a boyfriend, and I said no. "That's good," he said. "You're too good for high school boys. They're only after one thing." I just nodded, not knowing what to say. He then went on to ask if I liked Disneyland, and I said yes. He got excited and went on about how he would take me, but hotels were expensive, so we'd have to share a room. It would just be us, so my mom and his brother could be alone. He said my sister couldn't come, though, because he couldn't afford to pay for both of us to go. At this point, I was extremely uncomfortable, and I just wanted my sister to come back. She finally did, and he switched to just talking to her. She didn't notice anything was wrong, or that he kept looking at me. Once we finished, he took us home and invited himself in. I went to my room, locked the door, and hid. At one point, someone tried to open the door, but they stopped once they felt it was locked. My mom and her boyfriend came home around then. I tried talking to my sister, but she brushed me off. They had invited us back to their house, and I wanted so badly to stay home, but they forced me to go. Almost immediately, my mom and her boyfriend went to the room and left my sister and I with him. He got my sister drunk pretty fast and tried to get me to drink, but I kept refusing. It got to the point where my sister was almost blacked out drunk, and I was freaking out because once she passed out, it would just be us. I started texting my brothers, hoping one of them would pick me up. Thank God my eldest brother responded. I told him what was happening, and he came to get me. He showed up and told the guy that it was late and I had school, so he was taking me home. He tried to protest, but my brother was very firm about it. He loaded my sister into the car, texted my mom he was taking us home, and then we left. My brother didn't live with us since he was about 30 at the time and had his own family, so he didn't know what was going on. I told him the full story, and he got real quiet and then waited till my mom got home. He told her off and shamed her for putting me in that situation and told her that if it continued, he would move me into his house. My mom broke down then and told me she wanted to break up with her boyfriend because of his brother. And I found out when I was older that he would sneak by the door to listen to them when they were getting intimate. I think more happened, but my mom had never talked about it more than that. She broke up with him, got a good job, and sobered up with the help of my brother. It took my sister a lot longer, but she eventually got her life together as well. A few years ago, I worked at a small local pet store during college. I was one of 2 women who worked there, and we didn't generally work at nights together. This store kind of specializes in saltwater fish and reptiles in particular, so it wasn't too odd to have newbie reptile or aquarium people or people looking to just learn some more before actually getting a little companion. About a year into me working there, this one man would come in and start asking questions about the bearded dragons in particular. I humored him the first couple of times he came in and answered his questions for about an hour and a half to 2 hours each time he came in. But then he just kept coming in, not buying anything, not looking at other animals, refused to talk to my other coworkers standing right next to me. He was definitely a dude with a creepy vibe, but after about the third time this guy came in and questioned me about bearded dragon mating habits for an hour, we all started getting uncomfortable. He knew my schedule because we were such a small store. I would call my friends and tell them to come hang at the shop while he was there because he was just so persistent about talking to me, and only about the bearded dragons with the occasional, "Do you have a boyfriend?" or pickup line. I told him I wasn't interested each time and told him I had a boyfriend even though I didn't. At first, we were all pretty forgiving, chalking it up to social awkwardness, but it started getting scary when he'd come in, look for me, not find me, but he'd find my car, with significant damage at the time and decorated, very obviously my car back then, and just hang out outside the shop. My boss and managers started telling me to hide out in our back employees-only rat-mouse room when he'd come in. My friends were weirded out. I was getting uncomfortable around him, and my coworkers were actively trying to curb his enthusiasm for coming in. I ended up quitting that job. Around a month later, I'm watching the news with my dad, and oh, buddy, we were in for a surprise. This same guy had been escorted off of his ex's property in a local town by police, came back to the house the same night, and murdered her. When she didn't show up for work, her coworkers called for a welfare check. Police get there, he answers the door and tells them his name is Zeus. It most definitely was not his real name. Lets the police in, and they found her in the bathtub on a tarp. They also found bloody plates, silverware, and pans in her sink. He had cooked and eaten parts of her heart, liver, and brain. He's still waiting for trial in our state, and his interview and clips of news people questioning him while the police are escorting him to court are just bonkers. He tried to claim demonic possession at one point. He had previously murdered 2 people and had been released from prison before moving to our area. Trust your instincts about the people you interact with. People are just wild. This happened back in 2004 in northern Wisconsin. I was 16 at the time and out deer hunting with my dad and a friend of his, Frank. I do remember this day like it was yesterday, though. The dialogue isn't word for word, but the idea of it is 100% accurate. And as a side note, it was one day after 8 people were shot less than 2 hours away. I've linked the murderer below. My dad and I had a few different stands over an area of maybe 3/4 square mile. He had been hunting there for at least 10 years, and I had been going with him since I was 5. Up until I was 12, legal age to hunt with a rifle in my area, I had just been tagging along. This particular morning, we walked to my stand first. It was about 5 a.m., so still dark outside. I got situated, and my dad and Frank went off to our other 2 stands over a ridge, maybe another 500 to 600 yards off. Sitting there in the dark is always a little eerie. Not long after my dad and Frank left, I see a flashlight from the general direction of where they headed, maybe 200 yards away, roughly moving my direction. I figured they forgot something from the trunk or something, so I radioed to see what they were doing. "We're sitting in my stand. Frank is about to head to another one," he says. Obviously, this flashlight is someone else. This isn't super uncommon and isn't really a big deal. Those woods get crowded sometimes, and there was a spot to park in that general direction. I turn on my lights so that the other hunter can see that there is someone there. He stops. I see the light turn and go a different direction. No big deal. And I end up dozing off while it's still dark out. When I wake up, the sun is up. It's around 8 a.m. I sit there for a bit, radio my dad to see if he has heard or seen anything moving. Nothing yet. A couple of gunshots off in the distance is all, he says. I get up and go for a slow little walk to get my blood moving a bit. Not far, maybe 30 yards out and back, trying not to make a sound. I come back to my stand, sit down, and take a real good look around. Nothing really going on. I finally look out to my left where I had seen the flashlight before and see orange. For anyone unfamiliar, hunters have to wear blaze orange during gun season. I radio my dad and Frank to see if either one of them were moving around, and Dad says no. I hear nothing from Frank. I grab the binoculars out of my backpack to see if it's Frank. It's definitely not. This guy is looking at me through a scope, rifle aimed directly at me. This is a huge no-no. Massive rule we all learn in hunter's education to never point your rifle at someone you don't intend to shoot. Dumb people still do it, though. It's few and far between, but it happens, and this is why normal people use binoculars. My first thought, what a freaking idiot. Thing is, even with me looking at him, he doesn't put his gun down. Now, I'm starting to panic, thinking I'm going to be the next hunting murder victim. I slowly grab my rifle, get up, staying behind as many trees as I can, and walk down a little path to the side of my stand. My stand was on this kind of little knoll on the side of a much larger hill. Radio my dad, tell him what's up. He tells me to sit tight and stay out of sight. Obviously, as a 16-year-old, I couldn't do that and had to keep looking. Every time I looked, the guy was still aiming my direction, but was always standing in a different spot. Like I would look, go back to hiding, look again, and he would be 30 yards from where he was the last time. About 10 minutes of this goes by when my dad radios me. "How you doing, bud?" Looking back, he was very obviously trying to keep me calm. At the time, I thought he wasn't taking me seriously. He's still there, but he keeps moving. I don't know what his problem is. Dad told me to just keep hidden and he'll figure it out, that he'll be coming up near him in a minute or two. That's when I hear the shot. I lost my mind trying to get a hold of my dad. Did he just get shot? Where is he? Did he have to shoot the guy? What's going on? I sit there for maybe 2 to 3 minutes that felt like hours. "All right, come on out and head toward my stand." I peek up over the little knoll I was behind and see my dad waving from along the ridge the random guy had been on. I make the track on over to him and see what happened. Turns out Frank was feeling a little restless and took a little stroll and ended up on the other side of that particular ridge the stranger was on, not knowing he was there. He had knocked his radio battery loose while he was getting situated earlier in the morning and had no idea anything was even going on. The shot I heard was actually Frank shooting a deer. Dad said as soon as Frank shot, the guy ran away from us toward the logging road. We helped Frank out with his deer and decided to call it an early day. Although I was extremely nervous, thankfully the rest of the week went on with no incidents. Here in South Africa, we're in lockdown right now. I meant to travel for work to Santa Barbara, but since we're under lockdown, we can't go anywhere. So I'm an entrepreneur with a tech startup here, and since I travel mostly, I make use of the Regis co-working space for a hot desk or meeting room. It's quite flexible. There's always coffee and pretty girls coming in and out. Since the virus broke out, however, I saw Regis as a public or corporate office with many people coming in and out. Therefore, I was now stuck with no office. A buddy of mine told me he has an entire unused area at his house behind some offices. I would be alone. I'd have my own kitchen, lounge, TV, bathroom, etc. The catch, I would have to park on the road. So let me explain the way the road is. It's a wide, steepish road with a massive park and zoo on the left with 3 entrances and parking, and houses and businesses on the right. I use this road quite often to go to Florida Road, a popular bar and food district. There's only streetlights on the houses and businesses side. As there was a red line or no parking line alongside the road on the right and left, I had to park outside the park. So I parked in the first parking nearest to the building I was working at. It wasn't near, but I still had to work a few meters. I've attached the Google Street View here. The first parking space is where my car was parked, on the left side of the road, and the office was a building way down the road on the right. The story takes place one night before the lockdown. I had a call with a company in Denver, Colorado, which I had to start at 6 p.m. SAST. It went well, and I decided to pack up and leave. I wore formal shoes and carried my laptop on my back. Being paranoid, before I left, I looked on the CCTV before opening the gate. I didn't see anyone outside. I then proceeded to buzz myself out, lock up, and walk out. I don't know how, but in the time it took for me to walk from the building to the gate, a man appeared. He seemed drunk or high and just hanging around against the fence on the side of the road my car was, wearing a hooded sweatshirt with the hoodie down, torn brownish jeans, and sneakers. I started walking and looked down, keeping track of him from the corner of my eye. Mine was the only car left, so I would assume he knew that was mine. As I got closer to my car, I noticed him starting to walk out toward me. I ignored it. He was still walking diagonally, trying to cut me off. He then said, as he was maybe 5 meters away, "Let me help you with your bag." Now, I had a comfortable laptop backpack on. I was walking hands-free, and yet he asked to help me with my bag. In South Africa, car guards usually help you with your grocery bags and expect a 5 or 10 ZAR tip, but not this guy. This guy knew what I was doing, where I was going, and what I was carrying. To make matters worse, he had his left hand in his hoodie pocket and was now walking faster. It all went down in a split second. He suddenly lunged at me, but being a football player, I feigned left and went right. In that split second, I thought if I ran to my car, which was still another 10 to 15 meters away, I would have surely not made it. I'm fast, but fumbling my keys, opening the door, getting in, I didn't seem confident. So I made the decision of jumping the fence into the now dark park. I made it with one leap over, albeit slower since my laptop backpack kept bouncing on my back. As soon as I hit the ground, I took my laptop bag off, held it in my hand, and ran. I looked for a dark spot to hide, so I ended up behind a massive tree in the park. There are a few of them, but it was the only one that didn't have a light hitting it. I heard him running and slurring his words and saying something like, "Just give me the bag." So my car was on the other side of a tennis court. If I could get to the tennis court, sneak around that, and run to my car, I would make it. But there was a lit open space between this tree and the tennis court, and he was running straight through that space. I watched the angle of him running, and slowly rounded the tree to keep myself out of his line of sight. I honestly think him being high helped me immensely here, as he ran straight past and toward the other side of the park. When he was a distance away, which couldn't have been more than 20 meters, I made a break for it. Not being quiet now, I pushed away every branch and leaf, which he heard and turned around and saw. I burst around the tennis court. Stupid, 'cause I should have just went back the way I came. I turned around and saw him yelling and running back at me, stumbling every now and then, but picking up the pace and actually gaining on me. I could see he had a knife, and it was out now. I puffed my way up the hill, opened the car, and jumped in. I locked the door with my laptop on my lap and started my car. When I looked back at the darkness, he was gone. He must have slunk back into the park when I was out of range. But where? I didn't wait to find out. I skidded and drove out of there. I won't say I won't work there again. I would. But definitely next time, I'll be taking an Uber. This story happened to me and my girlfriend, now fiancée. To give some context, she and I met online in 2015 and fell in love. We communicated via Skype for 3 years before we lived in separate countries until I came to live with her in February 2018. So a few weeks or so before I flew to meet her, she had made friends with a group of guys in her hometown and I got to meet them shortly after living with her. They ranged in age from 16 to 18, and they would come to visit us very often because we lived close to the high school they attended. At first, I found it a bit weird that they would always come over and take up so much of our time, but they turned out to be really good friends over time. One of them even agreed to be one of my groomsmen recently. But back then there was one in particular that always bugged me. Dan. As I mentioned earlier, the guys would come and visit and hang out with us a lot, but Dan was the one that would always take up most of our time. I say this in the sense that he would message us early almost every day, asking if we were home and if he could come over, and would proceed to spend almost the entire day, from morning to night, or early afternoon to night, depending on his work schedule, at our place. He would also go out of his way to meet us and bump into us wherever we went, whether it was at the store, a coffee shop, or any other place you could think of. While I found this annoying, there wasn't anything particularly creepy or weird going on yet. Mind you, we live in a small town where it's almost impossible not to run into someone you know on the way to buy groceries or something like that. Plus, I had only known him for about as long as my fiancé had known him, which wasn't a very long time, so I thought I was maybe judging him too harshly. Also, he was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from another country whom he was hoping to meet in real life just like me, so I could at least relate to him on that aspect. I decided to let it slide, but made a note to keep an eye out for any suspicious behavior. The problem seemed to start once he also started trying to incorporate himself into other aspects of our life. He would make friends with anyone we'd been friends with for a long time, tag along with us whenever we were going to meet up with said friends, even though he hadn't been invited, hang out with them without us knowing, etc. My favorite instance, and the one that made me become more suspicious with him, was one time when we were going to hang out with some longtime friends of my fiancé. As the friend had finished her shift and we were getting ready to get into the car to drive over to her place, Dan suddenly shows up and joins us to their place uninvited. It was just so off-putting that he would just invite himself over without our friends or even our permission. Then, when we were done there and walking home, the three of us passed his house. We lived further away at the time and assumed he'd go home. But nope. He kept tagging along with us with the excuse that he needed to buy something at the store, which was nonsense since all stores had been closed for over an hour and he knew it. So he kept walking with us until at one point when we were almost home, we put our foot down and told him that we were tired and just wanted to go to sleep as soon as we got home and told him to go home. It took us 10 minutes to convince him, during which he would react to our requests with awkward and creepy silences until we finally headed home, annoyed. My fiancé, concerned that she had offended him, asked if he wanted to hang out with us later in the week. What followed was various weeks of him coming over to our place, staying until late at night, and him slowly leaving more and more of his stuff at our place so he'd have an excuse to come over. I kid you not, he once brought over his PS3 with a bag of 30 or so games, which stayed there for 3 months. I got to the point where people thought he'd moved in with us. He also seemed to have problems with all of our friends. Among other things, he would get into arguments with our friends and told one of our friends who was goofing around at our place once that he'd kill him if he didn't shut up. He lied to us and made us believe that 2 good friends of ours wanted to report us to the police for drugging our friend. I mentioned this earlier that some of them were 16 at the time. He allegedly hit one of our friend's girlfriends once. This was never confirmed, but I have no reason to believe it's a lie, etc. It was like he wanted us all to himself and to isolate us from our friends. The last thing he did, which ended up being the key to us getting rid of him forever, was that he had started dating my fiancé's cousin, MJ. He broke up with his long-distance girlfriend under suspicious circumstances and started dating her. As a result, whenever MJ came to visit, Dan would come along as well. My fiancé wanted to hang out with MJ. There was Dan. Even when he was dating someone else, his obsession with us never ended. One day, when we were in town, we met another friend of ours, and Dan insisted that we hang out with that guy all day when we'd already agreed to do something else. When we refused, he and MJ ditched us to be with him, and that was when we'd had enough. We got into a huge fight later that day in the park with some of our friends as witnesses and told him off, telling him we wanted nothing to do with him anymore and to pack up his stuff and to never show his face at our place again. This unfortunately resulted in my fiancé and MJ not talking to each other for a long time. We had to move a few times since then, the most recent being February of last year, and we never saw him and blocked him on all social media and blocked him out of our lives. We know from friends that he tried a few times to ask around where we live, but our friends always have our backs and don't tell him. MJ and my fiancé recently made up after she dumped him, and now that the sour taste he left behind is for the most part gone, it goes without saying that we never want to see him again. Now, a few questions that people had. People have asked if he had parents or what his home life was like and whether this might have affected his behavior. He does have parents, and I have no idea what his home life was like. All I know from friends and hearsay is that apparently he has violent tendencies, and that his family had to move from his hometown in the past because he had been accused of assaulting a teenage girl. I don't know if it's true or not, but considering what we've discussed here, I wouldn't rule it out. He can also be manipulative and tries to use people to get what he wants. He was 18 when we first met him and should be 20 by now. We found out recently that he moved out of his parents' house and got his own place. Some people have considered the possibility that he might have been in love or obsessed with my girlfriend. While I wouldn't rule it out, it was after talking to my fiancé's cousin that we figured another possible explanation. Dan loves to talk about cars, and he found out that my father-in-law likes to collect vintage cars and that he'd recently got his hands on a vintage highway patrol police car. As I mentioned, he tries to use people to get what he wants, and he figured if he could get along with us well enough, he'd get a chance to ride shotgun with him or even borrow the car. There was no chance that would happen, though, since Daddy-in-law treats that car like his own son and would never let anyone else drive it. And to the people commenting on how weird it is that we were hanging out with 16 to 18-year-olds, well, first of all, yes, we do have lots of friends our own age, and we do hang out plenty with them as well. I'll admit I found it weird myself at first when they would always come over and want to hang out with us, and was concerned about whatever rumors might start floating around. But the more I got to know them, the more I understood that they were pretty down to earth overall. Yeah, they could goof around a bit when we were hanging out, but for the most part, they're surprisingly mature for their age. Also, they would always ask first if they could come over, and they trusted us enough to confide in us with whatever was on their mind. Their parents know us and trust us as well, and they didn't feel the need to keep it a secret that they were friends with us. One's friend's mom had recently died of cancer at the time, and we found out from his father that he seemed happier and less depressed about it whenever he came home after spending time with us. Besides, we like to consider our home a safe space where anyone is welcome regardless of age, gender, race, etc. And while in hindsight that might have been part of the reason why someone like Dan slithered his way into our lives, as long as you're respectful and kind, we wouldn't have it any other way. This incident happened to me over the Christmas holiday this past year, and it just occurred to me that the sheer insanity of it may make it for a good fit for this sub. For reference, I'm a 24-year-old female. My cousin and I decided to go up a few hours north for a nice winter cabin weekend. It went great, nothing creepy at all. On our final day, we packed up at 6 a.m. and hopped in the car to get an early start on the 5-hour drive we had ahead of us. It was a foggy morning, not actively snowing, but previous snowfalls had piled up quite a bit, making the drive a little risky on the dark early hours of the morning. My cousin was driving, and we're chatting and listening to podcasts, not too aware of our surroundings. We were about 20 minutes into the drive when, unfortunately, the car skidded off the road a little, freaking black ice, and we very slightly grazed a tree. We got out to take a look, and by some miracle, there was no damage or anything on the car. As my cousin and I started to laugh with relief, we were just thanking our luck. I shielded my eyes because of some idiot with crazy high beams coming up behind us. So obnoxious, my cousin laughed, starting to open her door to step back in when the blinding headlight car honks and continues to keep at it as they approached us. My cousin and I looked at each other, super confused, but quickly hopped back in the car. The car begins to slow down and we're able to see a man in the driver's seat, and he finally takes his hand off of his horn and pulls up right next to my cousin's car, which is really dumb because we're off-road and it was crazy slippery. He rolls down his window and motions for my cousin to roll down ours. We figure it's fine because he's still inside his car and we're in ours. I know, probably still a stupid move. "Hey there, ladies. In a rush this morning?" He laughs. Not really, just trying to get home. Can we help you with something?" My cousin replies, totally stone-cold poker face. "Oh, no, I just noticed you dropped something about 2 kilometers back. It fell out of your trunk." My cousin turned to look at me. "Did you shut the trunk when we left?" "Yeah, dude, obviously," I replied, and knowing the way the car is shaped, we would have seen and definitely heard an open trunk. No thanks, sir. I think you might have mixed us up with somebody," my cousin said and immediately rolled up her window. This man just gave off bad vibes. He started blaring his horn again and motioning for us to roll down the window. My cousin rolls it down again and sees him holding up some women's underwear and smiling. "See? Look familiar?" I can literally remember the exact tone with which he said that. "No thanks, sir. You have a great day." My cousin quickly rolled up her window again and floored it, quickly hopping back on the road, and thankfully the man was either taken aback or just gave up and we didn't see him for the next hour or so. My cousin and I were both a little shaken up, but tried to laugh it off since we were safe and hadn't seen his car following us or anything. About 2 hours into our trip, we got off at an exit to fill up gas and grab some breakfast at a Starbucks. My cousin and I mobile ordered, and I was going to quickly run in to grab our food and drinks. It had started snowing at this point, and while the sun had been up for a little bit, it was still foggy and gloomy, making it hard to see the surroundings. I ran in, and as I reached for our food, someone's arm reached over mine to grab a napkin, and I instantly flinched back. When I looked up, I truly almost soiled myself. It was the guy from earlier. Despite him never getting out of the car, he did have his lights on and I was able to get a clear view of his face. It was him, I was sure. "Look at us, just like old friends." He smiled at me. I immediately looked down, grabbed my food and started walking out of the store. As I left, I heard him talking to the barista saying, "See that beauty queen? That's my beauty queen." What? I almost had tears in my eyes because I was so terrified. I power walked back to the car, almost tripping outside because I was so scared and not walking like a normal person. I hopped in and screamed, "We need to get back on the road. He's inside the Starbucks." My cousin started laughing, thinking I was pranking her, but she quickly realized that was not the case when the man walked out of the Starbucks a few seconds later, with no drink or food in his hand, walking straight towards our car, waving at us. My cousin quickly started to turn the car on when the man reached into his pocket. I genuinely thought he would pull out a weapon, holding up the underwear he had from before. Thankfully, my cousin took no time in backing out of there and speeding back onto the highway. We both were freaking out at this point, not sure how he ended up at the same stop as us despite us not seeing him behind us at all. He could have taken some sort of back roads we didn't know about, but it would have taken him much longer than us to get there. Unless he was trailing behind, I don't know. We quickly tried to find an alternate route on our Maps app, and thankfully there was one that made us go through some local roads which we hoped might help. Of course, with our luck, as we were going through a smaller town, I felt the car getting gradually lower on my side. We pulled over at a well-lit gas station and realized we were losing air in one of the tires. We were both too scared to get out, but figured if we went together it might be less scary. So we did. We filled up the tire with some air and it seemed to be okay. We got back in the car, back on our way. Everything seemed to be fine until 10 minutes later when this car seemed to appear out of nowhere directly behind us. My cousin and I looked at each other, having no idea what to do if it were the man. Our suspicions were confirmed when he blared his stupid horn yet again, then quickly swerved off the road to get right next to us, so this time he was on my side. He had his window rolled down and was screaming at us. At this point, I didn't care and called my brother-in-law, who's a cop. I know I should have called the actual police directly, and it was a stupid move, but in the moment, I was trying to justify this as being not that serious. My brother-in-law told us to drive directly to the nearest police station and to call them right away so that they would be alert. Literally as he was instructing me, the creep braked his car, just skid to a stop on the side of the snowy, icy road. We were still speeding away, so it quickly got harder and harder to see him, but from what I could make out, he had gotten out of his car and was sitting on the hood. Just sitting on the hood of his car in freezing, snowy weather. My cousin and I didn't want to stop to do anything with about an hour left in our journey. We decided just to book it straight home, and thankfully, that was the end of that.
So, this is something that happened to me about 10 years ago. I was 14 at the time, and had just moved to a new house, with my mother and father. I'm also a female with a slim build. I always have been skinny for as long as I can remember. We had just moved to New York, and it seemed to be a great place at first. Sure, there were some rude people, but that's like anywhere you live. I had to take the subway to get to school, and at the time, both my parents worked in the mornings, and we didn't have any other way to get myself to school. By this point, it had been a few weeks, and I really was starting to enjoy the ride in the early mornings. I would have to leave around 5 a.m. to make it from my house to the station and catch the train that would take me to school in time. So keep that in mind. I also didn't have a phone at the time. There were smartphones when this happened, but they were very expensive. My family didn't have the money to afford one for myself. I want to say it was a Monday morning when this had happened. And that might have been why my mind was elsewhere. I had a lot of projects that kept myself busy on the weekends. I don't have any brothers or sisters, and the only cousins I did have were close to 800 miles away. So I would build things in my room, or draw a lot. That was really fun. And now with this quarantine business, I have found myself doing those things again. That's what triggered this memory that I had buried away for so long. I had just gotten on the morning subway and noticed there weren't many people as there were usually. In fact, there was nobody on it, except myself and an older man. He was very tall, slender, had long, unkempt hair that covered most of his face. He also was wearing some beat-up clothes. I can see him in my head now, even as I type this out. I am extremely socially awkward, so looking at people when I'm in public can be hard, if not impossible at times. Now I wear headphones in my ears so others will not talk to me. But like I said before, I could even afford a phone, so an MP3 player was out of the question as well. I did, though, have a book with me. That I would read. So I did what I usually did and put the book up and buried my face in it. Looking back now, I wish I had not. Otherwise, I might have seen him making his way across the subway cart and closer to me. I remember reading my book, and all of a sudden this strong smell started to linger around me. It was very stale and smelled like piss, to be honest. I suspect he was homeless. When I catch the smell, it breaks my attention to my book, and I look up. And when I did, I saw him standing there right in front of me. Now all of these red flags I should have seen were going off like crazy. He just stood there for a long time, not saying anything at first. I still couldn't see his face, and his hands were shaking. He spoke softly and I couldn't hear him. I stuttered out the words, "I'm sorry?" Then he screamed at me, "You're gonna be sorry." The next part is kind of a blur. I remember him putting his hands over my face and pushing me into my seat. I was in such shock I couldn't even scream. Not that anyone could hear me anyways. I did try to push him off myself, but it was no use. He was not much bigger than myself, besides his height, but I still could not get him to budge. He started to whisper things in my ears that didn't make any sense. Some of it sounded like words, and some of it sounded like a mixture of many words. I remember the train announcer saying that the next stop was coming, and I felt some sort of ease pass over me. He must have heard this too. The next thing I knew, he was grabbing me by the feet and started to drag me to the far end of the cart. I had tried to hold on to the bars as best as I could, at this point now crying for help. As he was pulling me, the train had started to slow down and made us stop. I remember he was trying to put his hands over my mouth and face, and he was sitting on my leg so I couldn't get away. I couldn't see anyone at first getting on the subway, and the fear that when the doors closed again, he would most likely kill me set me into shock. I couldn't even move if I wanted to at this point. But just as the doors seemed like they were going to close, 3 other teenagers had jumped into the train and were laughing. I don't think they noticed us in the corner at first, but something came over me and I bit his hand as hard as I could. He screamed and that got their attention. They looked around at first, and when they spotted him, 2 of them had charged him, and one of them that I could see was calling out of the train to someone. They pulled him off of me and started to push him against the seats, and now whoever was being called to was coming onto the subway. It was one of the security guards that worked in the subway, and he was running to them. I just sat there for a long time. He was escorted off the cart, and they asked if I was okay. I don't remember a lot that was exchanged, but they did ask if there was anyone I could call. And me being 14, I didn't want to get in trouble. I said no and that I was fine. I spent the next couple of weeks covering my bruises with my mother's makeup, so no one would notice. Until this day, I still haven't told anyone in my family what happened. I never got on a subway alone again. So, Subway Man, I pray we never meet again.
Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let's Read Official, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, sleep tight, and don't let the lizard people bite.